Welcome to the Corporate Director Podcast, where we discuss the experiences and ideas behind what's working in corporate board governance in our digital tech-fueled world. Here, you'll discover new insights from corporate leaders and governance researchers with compelling stories about corporate governance, strategy, board culture, risk management, digital transformation, and more.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, Executive Director of the Diligent Institute, and I'm joined once again by my amazing co-host, Megan Day, Principal Solution Designer here at Diligent. Megan, how are you today?
I'm great, Dottie. Just enjoying the last bits of summer here.
I know this is always a time of year where I feel very wistful because I love fall weather and I love the colors of fall, but we start to get shorter days and it starts to get a little cooler and a little damper. And I'm not ready, Megan. I'm not ready for summer to be over. I need another beach day.
I hear you, and I can't complain. I'm about to go on a beach week down in North Carolina, so
Ooh.
some good positive travel happening.
That sounds great. Well, speaking of travel, I actually just came back yesterday from not sunny, very rainy and sort of cold Whistler, British Columbia, but it was absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. I was up there for the Governance Professionals of Canada. And Megan, that is always one of my absolute favorite events of the year. It's always just such a great conference. What a great dynamic group of people. And this year, we did a session that I really hope we get to repeat because it was so fun.
Love that. Tell me more.
Well, we did a session. We had three, veteran governance professionals up on the stage, people who've been corporate secretaries or attorneys working with companies as in-house counsel for many, many, many years. I think combined, we figured out we had something like, 70 years of experience up on the stage. And what we did was we had a session called Too Hot to Handle, the questions you've always wanted to ask, but were afraid to do so. And so we just had the audience submit questions anonymously on anything that they have dealt with as a governance professional that they would love to get some peer support on. And we got some great things. But one of the things kind of pertinent to your interview today that came up, which I thought was really fascinating, lots of things come up related to boardroom dynamics, as you can imagine, right? What do you do when your board chair is a little bit of a bully? Or what do you do when everyone's afraid of the CEO?
Always fun.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But this year, we also got a question about how to handle racism in the boardroom, which I thought was really interesting. And, it kind of came up in the context of many boards have been doing some hard work around diversity. But you know what? That doesn't change the nature of the people who are already there. And you can have some really ugly things happen in the boardroom. And there can be some situations that arise that need to be stopped and need to be addressed. And that work can be really hard and really challenging. And so I thought that was a really interesting topic of conversation. I won't go into too much detail because everything was meant to be off the record, but it was really eye-opening and not maybe too surprising. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And to be honest, I feel like I have heard only the rosy stories, in a post 2020 world, about everybody working hard and trying to make change and see progress both at the boardroom and across organizations. But we even know with the current, DEI backlash, if you will, that's happening around the world, that this is going to be a much harder change than I think a lot of people hoped.
Yeah, I think that's true. I will say, Megan, I'm not so sure how around the world the backlash really is.
I was just going to say sorry about that. Yes.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, there certainly has been a very, let's put it this way, a very well publicized DEI backlash, at least in the press here in the United States. And to be candid, I'm not sure really if it's true or if it's a little bit different. We'll talk more about that. But I think in Canada it's quite different. In Canada, there still is a very concerted effort, particularly in the heels of some awful, awful scandals that came to light related to the Indigenous peoples in Canada. And some really historic trauma committed by the Canadian government against First Nations in Canada and the reconciliation, sort of truth and reconciliation efforts that are underway by the government and by a lot of companies. But what's interesting is I don't know how many people have spent time looking at, and then what happens, right? So you bring on diverse candidates to the board, and then what? It's not that just adding diversity to the board solves all the problems. And I think it would really be fascinating. And maybe this is an area of research that we should think of doing at the Diligent Institute. I think it would be really fascinating to do some research about, and then what happens? What happens to the candidates themselves when they onboard? What happens to the board as a whole? What are some of the new challenges that they have to deal with? I'd be willing to bet that, handling racism in the boardroom is a little bit of a new topic area for a lot of boards, given that a lot of boards were pretty monochromatic for a long time, and now they're, hopefully less so. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it changes the biases and attitudes of the people who are onboarding or were already there. And so things come to a head, things raise their ugly head. And you then have to figure out how to deal with that in the context of having a solid board discussion. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and would love to get to know a little bit more about that. Would actually really love to hear from some of our listeners if this is something that you've been working on, or if this is an issue that you have interest in. I'm kind of fascinated by this and would love to dig into it a little bit more.
Well, that's a great segue, Dottie, to the conversation we have today. I spoke with Lori Mackenzie, who is the co-founder of the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. And they've spent a lot of time looking at and understanding the barriers to women's advancement in order to build a more inclusive workplace. And a lot of that work is starting to focus on the board, and not just around gender equality, but around inclusivity and what that really means. And I think that, as we'll hear Lori say, exactly what you said, though, the work doesn't stop when you have the people around the table and they've been elected in the seat and you have new faces for the first time. It really is going to have to be an ongoing process and something that is intentional for organizations and boards to focus on.
Well, let's give it a listen.
Joining us on the Corporate Director podcast today is Lori Mackenzie. Lori is co-founder of the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. The lab and the California Partners Project, which we've previously talked about on our show, formed a strategic partnership to advance a common goal of accelerating board diversity and effectiveness and providing tools and resources for boards to take action. Lori, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I gave a very brief overview of yourself and your role, but I would love to hear more about your fantastic background, this lab, and the types of projects that you work on.
Oh, I'd love to share. So the VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab at Stanford is pretty unique. It's what Stanford calls an impact lab. And what that means is we want to not only find the causes for the barriers why women are not advancing in the workplace, but we also want to find and study solutions. And so our goal is to work with organizations, with leaders, to help them understand what they can do better and to design practical tools like our toolkit to make them accessible to anybody.
That's fantastic. So let's set the stage for our audience. In years past, we have talked a lot about board diversity, but our producer, Kira, and I were talking recently. We haven't actually checked in a while. So how have things been looking numbers-wise for boardrooms diversity?
The numbers are good, although there is some concern today. I got the numbers from the California Partners Project, so thanks to my colleagues there who provided them. And the first thing I'd like to say is that SB 826, which was launched in 2018, had a big impact on the state of boards in California. In 2018, 29% of all California-based boards had no women on their boards. That's 183 companies. But by 2020, that number went down to just 2.3%. That's huge. Today, women hold about 1/3 of all board seats in California. Now, although there has been an increase, as of March of this year, that number of companies without women on boards went up to 4.1%. Now, having 30 compared to 183 is still pretty good, but we need to keep our foot on the pedal to continue the good progress in California.
Absolutely. So to that end, what are some of the biggest challenges or obstacles to creating a diverse and inclusive board?
I do get the sense from interviewing dozens of directors that boards want to do the right thing. And one of the challenges is that we have habits and practices that we're used to. And in many cases, those habits and practices evolved in a time when there wasn't a lot of awareness about the importance and value of board diversity. And I'll give you an example. One of them is the way that boards recruit. Boards tend to recruit from known networks, from the people they're closest to. And since the seats of power still aren't as diverse as the entire population, when boards recruit from peers, from CEOs, they tend to be recruiting from a not very diverse group of candidates. So a lot of the practices we're recommending are in favor of diversity, but also of board effectiveness. And they're just new habits that boards can develop and achieve their goals.
I love that, framing it up as just a new habit that we can all work on. Let's talk a little bit about best practices. One of your earlier playbooks in partnership with California Partners Project looks at how to actually build diverse boards. Can you talk a little bit about some of those best practices from that piece of work?
Absolutely. We interviewed dozens of directors, recruiters, and change agents, and we consolidated into 4 key steps the most important practices that boards can take. The first one is to use the board skills matrix. Now, boards do have the skills matrix, but sometimes it doesn't really serve as an active tool. What we discovered as a best practice is that having somebody interview all the directors and really deeply understand where the gaps and strengths are, and then using the board matrix as their main criteria for recruiting helps them see outside of those old practices of recruiting and really find new kinds of people, including professionals who might have marketing, go to market, cybersecurity expertise, as opposed to just sitting CEOs. And one of my favorites is to think about what kind of recruiting process you're having. There's so much research on equitable recruiting practices. For example, we know that if you ask different questions to different candidates, you won't get the same assessment of them. And sometimes our biases affect the questions we ask. So simply ensuring that you don't ask about expertise from one and then asking about international experience from another makes you have a fairer and more equitable recruitment process.
So simple, but very powerful. And I want to expand on that a little bit because you created a playbook on building inclusive boards more recently. So, diversity on one hand and moving to inclusivity. So, walk me through the evolution in this thinking. How does this playbook build on your other strategies and why is it so important?
Well, we know from decades of research that diversity is not enough. You also have to have the context to unleash the power of that diversity. So, if you simply add, for example, women to boards, it doesn't necessarily mean that the board is benefiting from their expertise. And that's why we focus on inclusion. And what we mean by that is how do you work to get every voice to contribute maximum value to the discussion? How do you ensure that groupthink isn't happening? Or that you might accidentally be pigeonholing somebody into a role where you're overlooking their expertise in another. Boards are solving really complex issues. The landscape changes almost every day. And so ensuring that all those voices are contributing is essential, and that led us to the focus on board culture.
I love that. So, let's talk a little bit about some of the takeaways from this playbook. How do we put this into practice?
Well, we designed 5 key steps that any board can take. And the way we designed it is that boards don't have to go through them in sequence. They could find and assess themselves and say, hey, we really need to focus on strategy 3. But the one I like the most is the very first. It's about establishing inclusive norms. And what it really means is a lot of our habits on boards are evolved over time and not necessarily well thought through. So simply taking a moment to assess and ask, hey, what's working? What's not working? What might we do to ensure that in these discussions, we get everyone's voice on the table? And then practicing that over and over again. This is a practice we've also seen in the National Association of Corporate Directors. They have a blue ribbon report that they developed. They also recommend establishing these norms and orienting and reorienting directors to ensure that everyone is on board with ways to make their boards more effective.
I love that. And that resonates with me right now because I am the chair of NomGov for an organization. And it is, we have to remind ourselves constantly to reevaluate some of these practices. So, what would your advice be to me or to another NomGov chair or board chair about how to navigate this?
I love that you're doing this not only from your interest, but also from your lived experience. And I'm hoping that you'll implement some of these ideas today. First of all, again, start with assessment. And let's say you discover that your board members only know each other on the surface, that even at board dinners, you tend to chit chat and not really discover what makes each other tick. And because of that, trust might be missing in the way that you discuss really thorny issues. We have a lot of tips we learned from directors about how boards build really strong and trusting relationships. For example, at board dinners, some boards assign a table topic and have people discuss what they're up to. Others use board retreats as ways to deepen experiences. One board member let us know that they have a little card to fill out, and they go to each director and discover a key fact about them. And the favorite example I heard was from a director who said each person is assigned a learning journey for their table at the board dinner. And they're supposed to explain something they're personally good at that affects how they make decisions. And this one director said he loves to fence. So he gave a little fencing explanation, which helps explain how he thinks about boardroom conversations. And people understood him so much better after that. So I think it's sometimes just trying different practices that other boards have used to shake things up, get to know each other more deeply, and then from that position of deep relationship, work on engaging around really thorny topics, which might include how do you navigate polarization in today's environment?
I love that. Well, great real life examples, certainly ones that I will keep in mind. Before we part ways, any best and final thoughts for our audience?
I would love to see the new state of board education to always include topics of culture, ways to make boards not only more effective at governing, but how they curate the conversations so that governance really includes the conversations and the value of each and every person. I so appreciate that Diligent is focusing on this at the next Elevate conference. I just want to say thank you for including me. This topic means so much to me. It's important that we see the value of diversity, not just to have it there because we think we have to. And I think focusing on culture is a big and important step in that journey, and I'm glad to be part of it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Lori. And want to ask you a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests, and very curious to hear your response. The first question is, what do you think the biggest difference will be between boardrooms today and 10 years from now?
I believe that board diversity is here to stay. I'm so excited to see that some major boards like Apple have 50-50 gender split. And I believe 10 years from now, that won't seem like an exception. It'll just seem like the way it is.
Love that. What is the last thing you read, watched, listened to that made you think about governance in a new light?
I'm reading a great book. I don't know if you've heard of The Friction Project.
I haven't.
It's a book by Huggy Rao and Robert Sutton at Stanford. And their idea is that you make good things easy to do and hard things hard to do. And that's such a great concept for governance. I think we don't think enough about making hard things hard to do. And that's a great way for me to rethink the role of appropriate friction in conversations, in decision making, and all the things that we do.
I love that. I am also a big believer in appropriate friction, so I will definitely check that out. All right, Lori, last question. What is your current passion project?
I am dabbling my feet into the topic of DEI and AI. So, what are the ways that DEI can help inform how we use AI, as well as how can AI perhaps inform how to do our work of diversity, equity, and inclusion better? So, something I'm exploring and excited about, and definitely a newbie in.
Very cool. Well, when you have some more insights there, we'd love to have you back on the show to talk about that. That is a very interesting topic for sure.
Thank you so much. I'd look forward to it.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Lori.
Absolutely.
Megan, thank you so much for sharing that interview. It is really great to have an opportunity to speak again about what's happening in California, what's happened since the diversity laws were struck down. I will say though, again, kind of going back to the conversation we were having just before we listened to the interview, clearly the law had a great impact, right? So before the law, 29% of California-based boards had no women on them. A few years later, that had gone down to 2.1%. Now it's gone back up to 4.1%. And so you could look at that one way and say, okay, clearly the backlash is having an impact. We're backsliding. There's now more boards that have no women. But I wonder if that really tells the whole story. I mean, I wonder for how many of those companies they would love to have women on their boards, but the women are leaving. And that's, again, like I'd love to really dig into what is happening to these boards that are working really hard on diversity and then really are struggling to keep the diverse candidates and why. That why question I feel isn't getting quite enough research attention. So Kira Ciccarelli, who's our producer and our lead researcher at the Institute, probably taking note. Maybe this is something we need to dig into next year. I think it's really interesting.
Reach back out to Lori and see if we can get a project going with them and the California Partners Project.
I think maybe we need to. Yeah, it's really kind of interesting. But also just one other thing I wanted to talk about too, Megan, because these days it's all things AI. I mean, there must have been probably 5 or 6 different sessions that touched on AI at this conference that I attended, and at the end there, when we're asking for her passion project, she's of course talking about the connection between diversity, equity, and inclusion and AI, and not just reducing bias in AI, but how can AI be used to help positively influence diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And there's so much happening in that space. And I don't know if you caught the latest CEO Daily from Fortune this morning, kind of looking at what's happening with NVIDIA and just the fortunes of NVIDIA and how things are shifting. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
No, I was just going to say, I read a funny article this morning about NVIDIA and basically keeping the stock market afloat right now.
Yeah, there's a meme going around that sort of has this like porch that's dangling off a house, and it's got these 2 big pillars propping it up, and it's like, this is the U.S. economy, the porch, and one pillar is Taylor Swift and the other one is Ozempic. It's like, and I think that's you could probably put a 3rd pillar and it would be NVIDIA.
Oh my God, that's funny.
I know.
That is funny.
Really funny. Yeah.
Well, what comes to mind, the whole NVIDIA thing and AI, actually takes me back to a comment you made about California being on the cutting edge of diversity efforts. They're also on the cutting edge of AI and safety and some of the regulations that might be happening down the line. They just passed another state legislation or advance rather, SB 1047. Just passed in the state assembly. And that basically is a bill that requires companies to make sure that their technology related to AI doesn't cause major harm. It still obviously has to be approved, but very interesting to see that some of the regulations that we've seen elsewhere in the world, I'm thinking mainly of the EU AI Act, how that could start to play out here in the US. That sounds like a topic for another show, though.
I think it is. I think we definitely need to have another conversation about that. And we've got some guests coming up that I think will be perfect to speak with about that very issue. But yeah, it's definitely a space to watch. And Megan, I don't know if, I mean, look, I'm of a certain age, right? So I feel like I've seen parts of this movie before many, many times where a new technology comes to fruition. We all believe it's going to murder all of us. And then we all kind of settle in and say, yeah, but okay, we just like using it. It's fine. I don't think we're quite there yet with AI, but we're getting close. I feel like we're hearing a few fewer of the doom and gloom scenarios of general AI enslaving the human population and turning us all into batteries, and a few more of there's a lot of potential here. And as long as we put good guardrails in place, this could be kind of awesome conversations. And so it'll be interesting to see.
I just have to laugh, Dottie. I feel like this is like the 2nd or 3rd conversation in a row we've had where it's basically ended with like, oh, well, the world's going to explode, so what does it matter anyway?
Why does anyone listen to this podcast, Megan? I just don't know. Maybe it's because we're nice. So we may have good senses of humor while we talk about doom and gloom. Well, anyway, I think there's a lot to chew on there. We'll have to do some more episodes on AI coming up here. But it was great to have an opportunity to hear from Lori Mackenzie, and I'm really glad you had an opportunity to speak with her and to share that interview with us. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Corporate Director Podcast, the voice of modern governance. We'd like to say a few special thank yous, first and foremost to our stalwart diversity, equity, and inclusion champion, Lori Mackenzie, podcast producer, Kira Ciccarelli, the team at Oxenfree for making this podcast a reality, and most especially Diligent Corporation for sponsoring this show. If you like our show, please be sure to give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. You can also listen to our episodes and check out Inside Today's Boardrooms, presented by Diligent Institute, a weekly web show covering best practices for today's corporate boards and committees by going to diligent.com/resources. Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to the Corporate Director Podcast. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to learn more about corporate governance and tools to help directors do their job better, visit www.diligent.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.